Forms of communication used by people with deafblindness. Raffaela Lupetina. Postdoctorate student in the Graduate Program in Education, Contemporary and Popular Demands at the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. PhD in Education from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Master in Education from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Interpreter's Guide to Work with Deafblind People certified by the Brazil Support Group for the Deaf and Multiple Sensitive Disabled. Graduated in Pedagogy from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Hi, my name is Raffaela Lupetina and I want to thank the channel Desvendando o Universo da Surdo-Cegueira for the invitation. Today, I'm going to talk about the knowledge and the experience I've lived in the universe of deafblindness. Here on this screen on the side, you are going to see 3 slides. The first one is with my educational background, and the other 2 are with topics about the subject of this video. Regarding my educational background about the deafblindness is relevant to emphasize my first doctoral research that was about the life story of acquired deafblind people. I traveled to some states of Brazil and I could be in touch with deafblind people. I talked to them respecting their ways of communication. And it was an amazing experience, and during the 4 years of doctorate, I could learn more and more about the universe of deafblindness. I realized that we are in constant learning and it's becoming more and more important that we publish and talk about deafblindness to show people the importance of the deafblind. Besides it, it's important to emphasize the interpreter guide course that I took by Grupo Brasil. It was so important to learn the ways of communication of acquired deafblind people. Because the interpreter guide is the professional who works with the acquired deafblind. The mediator trainer works with the congenital deafblind. The interpreter guide course was very important to continue my research and to keep me in touch with the deafblind people. Now I'd like to specifically get in the subject of the video. The knowledge I want to share with you is about the ways of communication of the deafblind. Each deafblind communicates by one way of communication that adapts him best. Also the residue that he has or that he doesn't have. The time of loss interferes in the way of communication he uses. The deafblind often has some hearing residue or visual residue or both, or has only hearing residues or only visual residue, or he doesn't have any residue at all. This all interfere in the way of communication he uses. I am going to talk about the main ways of communication used by the deafblind. The first form of communication is the tactile sign language. Tactile sign language is the adaptation of sign language for touch. In the case of Brazil, sign language is Libras. But in other places, it's another sign language. It depends on the place. But when we are talking about deafblind people, the sign language initially used is visually in a visual airspace. It has to be adapted by tact because the deafblind uses a lot of tact to communicate. Some adaptations can be made in tactile sign language to provide better communication between the deafblind and the interlocutor, or the deafblind and the interpreter guide. Just to explain the hand configuration when we use tactile sign language. Who receives the message gets the hand on top, and who passes the message gets the hand at the bottom. And then you do the signs at the bottom. Sometimes some people put both hands. Sometimes some people put just one hand at the bottom and pass the message on, and later do movement in the opposite. In order to adapt, it can be made, of course, using the sign language and visual airspace field to the tactile sign language. All adaptations are in order to make communication less tiring. For example, when we are going to make the word forget sign. In conventional sign language, we make this movement with our hands running across our foreheads. We do the same sign for the deafblind who uses the tactile sign language and for the deafblind who has his hand over the hand. We have to raise our arm and make this movement. Every time you raise your arm and shoulder and you move your arms during the conversation, it can get tiring. So an adaptation can be made. You can use the hand as if it were the representation of our head and make that movement of forget where the forehead is. And you don't need to raise your hand all the time to make the face movement. This is just an example of adaptation. Of course, there are other adaptations that can be made. In agreement between the deafblind and the interpreter guide. It's important to clarify that greater the interaction between the interpreter guide and the deafblind, better the communication will be. Regarding any way of communication, this interaction between the interlocutor and the deafblind helps a lot. The second way of communication is sign language in a reduced field. This kind of sign language is used by deafblind people who have visual residue. It's performed at a shorter distance. The person who is performing and signing and the deafblind are relatively close at a shorter distance than in conventional Libras. At translating time, the interpreter guide doesn't make large signals, because normally the deafblind person who has visual residue has a reduced field sphere and a smaller visual field, so we have to make more measured signals that they don't exceed that form of vision. So this kind of communication is used by deafblind people who have visual residues. The next way of communication is Tadoma. In Tadoma, the deafblind places his hand over the mouth, chin, and throat of the interpreter guide, and the person who's speaking needs to remember that the deafblind who uses Tadoma, he will place his hand in a way he feels more comfortable. It's usually in the shape of L. It's like the letter L picking up mouth, chin, and a little throat vibration, but it will depend on how the deafblind feels more comfortable, and the person who's speaking will speak in a natural way as if the person was speaking in the same tone of voice of everyday life. It will allow the deaf person to put his hand over the deafblind mouth, so this way the person can pick up the message. The next way of communication is palm writing. Palm writing is an alphabetic system that needs letter by letter. In this way, the interlocutor makes the shape of the letter in the way we know it. The most used form is the capital letter. But some people use a cursive letter. But the most recommended letter is the capital letter on the hand of the deafblind. And the deafblind's gonna feel that letter and he'll figure the message. This form of communication is used by deafblind people who know the Portuguese language or the language that's being spoken. As he knows the writing, he will recognize those letters. Some deafblind people have no sensibility in their hands, so they choose other parts of the body to receive this writing. Some choose the side of the arm, some choose the thigh, some choose the back. It will depend on where the deafblind has more sensibility to receive the message. The next way of communication is oral language or extended speech. This way of communication is used by the deafblind people who have hearing residue. In this way of communication, the interpreter guide or the interlocutor who passed the message on gets close to the deafblind ear and talks calmly, clearly with a louder voice, so that the deafblind understands the message. Since the sound is not going to disappear in the place and it will be close to the person's ear, the deafblind can take advantage of the visual residue he has. The guide gets even close to his ear and speaks clear. Some deafblind people prefer that, instead of the guide gets close to his ears and stand in front of him. It will depend on each needs every deafblind person has. The next way of communication is the tactile or manual braille. They are broken in two possibilities. The first one uses the index finger and the middle finger, simulating a braille cell. This way, as our fingers have some lines, these lines simulate the division of the braille cell. The braille cell is in 2 columns and 3 rows, totaling 6 dots. The middle and index fingers, along with those divisions, will simulate the braille cell. In this way, the interpreter guide or the person passing the message on will make the braille dots on those 2 fingers as if he were writing in braille. And the deafblind who receives those dots goes letter by letter, forming the word. The second possibility of tactile or manual braille is when the deafblind places both hands, simulating the braille machine keys. The dots are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In this way, the deafblind puts the 3 fingers of both hands simulating the writing on the braille machine. And the interpreter guide puts his hand over hand and simulates the writing of the machine. Letter by letter, the deafblind will figure the message. An important thing is that the manual tactile braille is a form of communication that is often used by deafblind people who lost their sight or they were born blind, or that they lost their sight first throughout their lives and then later lost their hearing. They are deafblind who learned braille and know braille. They know braille writing. When they lose the second sense, they take advantage of the knowledge of braille as a form of communication. So that's all for now, guys. I just shared with you here the main forms of communication of the deafblind people. I hope this video has called your attention to be more interested in the universe of the deafblindness, and you can get even more interested in communicating with the deafblind. That's credits. Translation in Libras, Brazilian Sign Language, by Renan Antonello. Portuguese subtitles by Franciele Freitas. English subtitles by Ana Carolina Toledo. Subtitle review by Paulo Mota. Dubbing by Ana Carolina Toledo. Edition by Fernanda Falkowski and Renan Antonello.